I smelled cinnamon and carved turkey before I saw her stand. My name is Evelyn Marston, 71, widow of a lumber man and the quiet co-founder of what used to be our family's pride. I tell you this from the head of my son's long Vermont table on Thanksgiving, a place that used to be mine until the chairs were rearranged and my name was gently nudged off the seating cards. Sabrina raised her glass and did not look at me. Daniel avoided my eyes the way men avoid mirrors. Grace tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and mouthed a small hello. That felt like a lifeline. Outside, ice clung to the porch rail. Inside, the air was warm and sweet and bruising. You've made everyone uncomfortable for months, Sabrina said like a hostess, noting a stain on a napkin. After tonight, we all agree it's best if you keep your distance from the company, from the house, from us. Her words slid across the tablecloth and stopped at my plate. It would have been easy to crack, to cry, to argue. Instead, I reached for my handbag, the old leather one Richard bought me when the first mill turned a profit. The zipper rasped like a saw-tooth. Catching my fingers found the envelope. Heavy cream, thick with the kind of weight money gives to paper. $82 million sat inside it, not as cash, but as signature and instruction, a cord that could pull an empire flat if I chose to. Tug. Richard's letter, the trust instrument, my right to end the pretense. I set the envelope beside the cranberry the weight of what had been earned before she arrived. The envelope on the table reminded me I wasn't here to win their approval anymore. I was here to remind them of what had been forgotten, that I was not a shadow, and this family's fortune was not theirs to squander. The reckoning had only just begun. The first years of the company were lean, but they were ours. I can still hear the creak of the old truck as Richard and I hauled lumber to buyers across county lines. The beds stacked high and rope tight against the wind. My hands blistered from helping load boards. My nails chipped from filing contracts at the kitchen table. Yet I carried a strange pride in every ache. We weren't rich, not even close. But we were building something brick by brick, plank by plank. Neighbors called Richard a visionary, and he had the charisma, the way of standing tall and speaking plain, so men trusted him. But visions die without detail, and I was the detail. I tracked which suppliers paid late, which banks offered leniency, which men drank too much on Friday and came short on Monday. Richard would come home from a meeting, kiss my cheek, and ask quietly, "What do you think?" My answer often turned the tide. He knew it. I knew it. But no one else did. As the mills grew, so did the distance between the public version of our lives and the private one. At banquets, I was introduced as Richard's lovely wife. At board meetings, I wasn't invited at all. I learned to wear silence like a fine coat, smiling at the right moments, keeping my thoughts tucked safe where no one could steal them. There were nights, though, when Richard would sit across from me, exhausted, glass of bourbon in hand, and whisper, "If anyone deserves the chair at the head of this table, it's you." I would laugh and shake my head. I didn't need the chair then. What I needed was his recognition, his partnership, and I had that until I didn't. Watching Daniel, now stiff and uncertain beside Sabrina, I realized how little he knew of those early days. To him, wealth was inherited. Like eye color, he never saw the drafts that froze our breath in the office, never tasted the fear of payrolls due. And Sabrina, she only knew the shine, not the struggle. That ignorance was dangerous, and in their hands, it had already begun to rot what we built. The trust had been meant to protect them. Instead, it had become my weapon, and I was no longer afraid to wield it. Richard's funeral was held on a gray November morning, the sky hanging low as though it knew the world had tilted. Men from the mills came in pressed suits, their hands calloused and restless, unsure how to mourn a man who had once barked orders and laughed with them over cheap beer. I stood by the casket, numb, clutching Grace's hand while Daniel kept a polite distance. Sabrina wept into a silk handkerchief, her tears as precise as the diamonds on her fingers. After the burial, the house shifted, chairs were rearranged, keys quietly exchanged, routines rewritten. I was told with gentle smiles that it might be comforting for me to stay in the small garden cottage behind the main house, as though exile could be softened by flowers in bloom. I agreed because grief makes you pliable, and because I didn't want to start a war. Not yet. The cottage was charming on the surface. Ivy clung to its stone walls, and the scent of roses drifted in through the windows. But charm wears thin when it is given as a cage. Sabrina visited often, carrying trays of tea and biscuits, her voice syrupy sweet, as she asked if I was managing all right out here. She always sat in the larger chair, crossing her legs elegantly, as if she owned the ground beneath us both. I smiled back, thanked her for her thoughtfulness, and studied every glance, every slip of her tongue. Daniel rarely came. When he did, it was quick. A nod at the door, a vague promise to call. His eyes slid away from mine, guilt simmering just beneath his skin. I wanted to shake him, to remind him of the woman who stayed awake when he was sick as a child, who sewed his costumes for school plays, who cheered at his ball games no matter the score. But my words would have bounced off the armor Sabrina had wrapped around him. Each tea visit, each polite exile, pressed the truth deeper. I was being erased, not only from the house, but from the history I had built. They believed the quiet widow would fade into the wallpaper, sipping tea until memory claimed her. They had forgotten Richard's letter, locked away in the safe. They had forgotten that silence can keep accounts as sharply as words. And one day, silence learns to strike. The key to the safe was hidden in the back of Richard's dresser, tucked inside an old cufflink box. I had known its place for years, though I never touched it while he lived. One rainy afternoon, when the cottage walls pressed too close, and Sabrina's latest visit left the taste of iron in my mouth, I opened that drawer and let my hand rest on the box. The safe clicked open with a sound that echoed like a memory. Inside were the usual things: insurance policies, deeds, a few velvet pouches of jewelry he had insisted I keep, though I rarely wore them. And then, folded neatly in an envelope marked with my name, was the letter. Richard's handwriting was steady, each stroke deliberate. Evelyn, if the day comes when you are treated with disrespect, if your role in our life's work is dismissed or abused, know that you have the authority to dissolve the trust. Protect what we built. Protect yourself. My eyes blurred as I read, but my pulse steadied. Richard had known. He had anticipated that power without respect would curdle, that those who hadn't built would think themselves entitled to reap without consequence. He had left me the weapon and the shield. I pressed the paper to my chest and closed the safe. The cottage seemed different afterward. The roses still bloomed, the ivy still climbed, but the air felt less like confinement and more like strategy. They thought they had tucked me away, but in truth, they had given me space to plan. That evening, I brewed my own tea. Instead of waiting for Sabrina's tray, I sat by the window as rain streaked the glass and whispered to Richard as though he might still hear me. You gave me the choice, and I won't waste it. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something that was not grief or humiliation. It was resolve, sharp and quiet like the edge of a blade hidden in folds of velvet, and I knew with a certainty that steadied me that the day of reckoning was drawing near. Suspicion began as a whisper, nothing more than a number that didn't match. I was helping Grace with her school application one afternoon when I noticed the scholarship fund that Richard and I had earmarked for her tuition seemed lighter than it should have been. At first, I thought it was my memory playing tricks, but numbers have always spoken clearly to me. I went back through the statements, tracing deposits and withdrawals with the same patience I once used to stretch payroll in the early days. The figures told a story, and it was not the story Sabrina wanted anyone to see. Money meant for Grace's future had been funneled elsewhere. Small transfers, careful at first, masked under vague labels like educational initiatives and community outreach. But the trail grew bolder, greedier. A purchase appeared in Colorado, a chalet in Aspen registered under an LLC, with no history. The more I searched, the more threads unraveled. Sabrina had not only dipped into Grace's fund, she had carved pieces from the estate itself, tucking them into shells that bore her name in quiet corners. I gathered photocopies, highlighted statements, built files the way I used to prepare quarterly reports. When the stack grew too heavy to hide in the cottage, I carried it in a leather folder to Helen Carter, my lawyer and old friend. Helen listened without interrupting, her eyes narrowing as she turned each page. This isn't just mismanagement, she said. Finally, her voice low but certain. It's misappropriation, financial abuse. You can move now if you want to. Evelyn, you have the authority. But I shook my head. Timing mattered. A strike too early might be softened, explained away, smoothed with apologies and half measures. I wanted no apologies. I wanted clarity. I wanted the kind of moment where Sabrina could not deny what she had done, or Daniel would have to see the truth without her whispering in his ear. That night, I spread the documents across my small kitchen table. The pages glowed under the lamp, evidence of betrayal laid bare. My hands did not shake as I organized them into neat stacks, each one another nail in the coffin of Sabrina's pretense. The trust had been meant to protect the family. Now it would expose them, and I was the only one left willing to hold it up to the light. The invitation arrived in a cream envelope embossed with Daniel's name, though the handwriting on the inside was unmistakably Sabrina's. Sharp, elegant, strokes like daggers dressed in silk. She wrote that Thanksgiving dinner would be a family gathering to honor tradition, and she hoped I would find comfort in being included. I almost laughed. It was the sort of politeness that bruised harder than open insult. I placed the card on my cottage mantel and studied it for a long while. There was no warmth in those words, no real welcome. It was a summons, a performance, staged so she could pretend kindness while tightening her grip. She had no idea the stage lights were about to turn on her. I called Helen that evening. We sat at her oak desk under the weight of my folder filled with evidence. She reviewed my signatures, the authority Richard had granted me, the clauses that gave me the right to dissolve the trust if abuse was proven. It's airtight, she said, tapping the final page with her finger. The moment you act, there's no going back. I don't want to go back, I answered. My voice sounded foreign too. Me, stronger than I remembered. In the days that followed, I prepared with the precision of a woman who had balanced ledgers her whole life. I made copies of the documents, signed the orders, sealed them in the envelope that would sit by the cranberry relish. I practiced the words I would say, not many, just enough to pierce through the noise. Every sentence needed to land like a gavel. The night before Thanksgiving, I laid out the dress I would wear. Navy wool, simple but commanding. I polished Richard's old cufflinks and pinned one to my lapel as though he would walk with me. At the kitchen table, the envelope weighted heavy with truth. I sipped my tea, calm in a way that surprised me. Tomorrow, Sabrina would believe she was banishing me. She would smile. She would pin. She would wield her power. And then with the turn of my hand, I would end her charade. Tomorrow was not her stage. It was mine. Thanksgiving arrived with a sky the color of pewter and a wind sharp enough to cut through wool. I walked up the steps to Daniel's house, carrying only my handbag. The envelope pressed flat. Inside, the windows glowed with amber light, laughter spilling out before the door even opened. For a moment, I felt the familiar ache of belonging. But then, Sabrina appeared in the doorway, her smile as polished as the brass knob she clutched. Evelyn, she said smoothly as if the name itself were a charity she was bestowing. So glad you could join us. I stepped inside, the air thick with roasted turkey, cinnamon pies, and the hum of voices layered with expectation. Daniel kissed my cheek quickly, eyes darting away, and guided me to a seat at the far end of the table. Grace slipped me a smile across the plates, a small rebellion of warmth. Dinner unfolded like a play. Sabrina serving with perfect grace. Daniel carving beautifully. Relatives making polite conversation that skimmed the surface of things. My envelope sat in my handbag, a silent weight that seemed to throb with each passing course. When dessert arrived, pumpkin pie crowned with whipped cream, Sabrina rose to her feet, her glass in hand. She cleared her throat. Before we cut the pie, there's something to be said. It's time for clarity. Evelyn, you've been difficult. For the sake of harmony, we think it best you distance yourself from the company, from our affairs, from us. Her words slid into the silence like a blade. I felt Daniel's relief in his stillness, the way a man feels when someone else fights the battle he cannot. I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope. It landed on the tablecloth with a quiet thud, the kind of sound that steals the air from a room. Forks stilled. Grace leaned forward. Sabrina's eyes flicked down, confusion tightening into fear. Then we should all be clear, I said evenly. This is the dissolution of the Marston trust. Every misuse, every theft, every dollar redirected to Aspen or vanity charities, it's documented, effective. Immediately, the funds are recalled. Daniel's fork scraped across porcelain. Sabrina's smile cracked, brittle as glass. The room fell into stunned silence. And for once, I was not invisible. I was the reckoning seated at their table. The morning after Thanksgiving, my phone began to ring. Before dawn, calls stacked one after another. Daniel's number flashing, then Sabrina's, then relatives who had sat silent the night before. I let them all go to voicemail. Their voices poured through the speaker in a flood of anger, pleading, threats, even tears. I listened only once, long enough to recognize desperation. And then I turned the phone face down on the counter. Instead of answering, I drove into town, and walked into Helen's office. She had already received copies of the signed documents, and her desk was a fortress of legal responses. "We'll file the petitions today," she said. "They'll be served by Monday. You don't need to speak to them directly." Again, relief settled over me like a blanket. For the first time in months, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. My silence wasn't weakness anymore. It was control. Sabrina could shout. Daniel could beg. The cousins could gossip until their throats went dry. None of it mattered. Now that evening, I returned to the cottage, brewed my own tea, and sat in the quiet. I didn't check the messages piling up. I let the house breathe with me, walls steady and unbothered. Somewhere across the main lawn, lights blazed and doors slammed. The sound of panic where arrogance had lived only yesterday. I didn't need to see it. I already knew. The tide had shifted and I had turned it without raising my voice. 2 days later, a letter slipped beneath my cottage door. The handwriting was uneven, teenage, and earnest. "Dear Grandma, I don't care about houses or money. I care that you see me, and you always have. You're the only one who asks about my drawings, who listens when I talk. I want you to know I stand with you. I'm proud to be your granddaughter." I pressed the paper to my chest, tears finally breaking free. Grace's words cut deeper than any legal decree. They reminded me that family wasn't measured in assets. It was measured in loyalty. I left Vermont quietly without announcement or farewell. The lawyers carried on with their filings. The trust moved forward under new terms, and the cottage keys lay on the counter when I closed the door. What I carried with me was Richard's letter, Grace's note, and the steady belief that dignity is worth more than applause. The house in Maine sat on a bluff above the sea, its shingles weathered gray, its porch wide enough for rocking chairs, and silence. The first morning I woke there, gulls circled overhead and the ocean stretched endless, unbothered by human quarrels. I brewed tea, sat by the window, and let the salt air wash through me. Sometimes I think of that Thanksgiving table, the hush after my envelope touched the cloth, the fear in Sabrina's eyes, the stunned silence of Daniel. But the memory that lingers isn't their downfall. It's Grace's letter folded in my pocket, soft from being read too often. I am not invisible anymore. I am exactly where I chose to be, seen, steady, and free. And that, more than $82 million, is the inheritance I claim. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these family drama and revenge stories, please subscribe and join me for more every day.